14th, 2019. A rescue helicopter pilot in Alaska picked up a distress signal from 10,500 feet on the St. Elias Range. When he reached the coordinates, he saw a man lying face down on bare rock, less than 200 meters from base camp, clothes shredded, hands caked in dried blood, his right leg swollen to 3 times its normal size. That man had crawled for 3 days and nights across a glacier with a shattered knee, broken ribs, no food, and almost no water. And before that, he had fallen 80 feet into a glacial crevasse after his best friend cut the rope that was keeping him alive.
My name is Leonard. I'm 65 years old. I've set foot on every continent, from the summit of Kilimanjaro to the old-growth jungles of Borneo. I thought I'd heard every survival story there is, but when I learned what happened to Marcus Reed and Dylan Cole on Mount Kaskawulsh, I realized there are limits of human endurance that even I could never imagine.
This is a story about loyalty, about a choice no one should ever have to make, and about a promise to a pregnant wife that a man kept at all costs, even if it meant crawling through hell itself. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from right now. And if you want to hear stories like this one all the way through, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next, you won't be able to stop listening.
Marcus Reed first saw Alaska from the window of a twin-engine prop plane descending into Anchorage on a gray morning in early May. The mountains below were enormous, white and silent, stretching in every direction like the spine of some ancient, sleeping creature. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and felt his heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the kind of reckless excitement that had pulled him toward high places ever since he was 20 years old and stood on his first real summit with shaking legs and tears he couldn't explain.
He was 29 now, lean and angular, with dark brown hair that he kept short and a quiet intensity in his eyes that people often mistook for coldness. He was not cold. He was focused. That was the word his wife Lauren used when she wanted to be kind about it, and the word his co-workers at the aerospace engineering firm in Anchorage used when they didn't. Marcus had the kind of mind that locked onto a problem and would not release it until it was solved, or until he collapsed trying, and this quality had served him well in engineering and in climbing, but had cost him in almost everything else. He did not make friends easily. He forgot birthdays. He missed dinner reservations because he lost track of time, staring at route maps pinned to the wall of his home office. But when he loved something or someone, he loved it completely and without reservation. And the 2 things he loved most in the world were climbing mountains and Lauren. Sitting beside him on the plane was Dylan Cole, 32, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered with a thick reddish beard, and the easy, unhurried manner of a man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors. Dylan was a climbing guide by profession, certified and experienced, the kind of person who could read a snowfield the way a sailor reads the sea. He had grown up in a small town outside Boulder, Colorado, where his father ran a hardware store and his mother taught elementary school, and he had started climbing at 14 when a neighbor took him up a local crag on a Saturday afternoon. By 18, he was leading multi-pitch routes. By 25, he had summited peaks across 3 continents. He and Marcus had met at the University of Colorado, where Dylan was finishing a degree in outdoor recreation he never intended to use, and Marcus was deep into his engineering program. Dylan taught Marcus to climb on the sandstone walls outside Boulder, patiently correcting his footwork and his grip, and his tendency to muscle through problems instead of thinking through them. From that first season together, they became partners, not just in climbing, but in the particular kind of trust that forms between 2 people who regularly hold each other's lives at the end of a rope. Over the next decade, they climbed Rainier, Denali, and several peaks in the Peruvian Andes, each expedition deepening a bond that neither of them talked about much, but both understood completely. Their target this time was Mount Kaskawulsh, a 5,800-meter peak in the St. Elias Range, whose north ridge had never been completed in spring. The route was technical and committing, a sustained line of steep ice faces, knife-edge snow ridges, and sections of mixed rock and ice that offered no easy retreat once you were committed. Several teams had attempted it in summer with varying degrees of failure. No one had tried it in the volatile conditions of early May, when the weather could shift from clear skies to whiteout blizzard in less than an hour, and the snow was unstable from the seasonal transition. Dylan had studied the route for over a year, collecting photographs, reading expedition reports, and corresponding with a Canadian climber who had turned back at 4,900 meters the previous July after his partner developed pulmonary edema. The Canadian told Dylan that the upper ridge was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and that the mountain had a way of making you feel very small and very alone, even when someone was standing right beside you. They established base camp at 3,200 meters on a broad glacial shelf with a clear view of the North Ridge rising above them like a white wall tilted against the sky. With them was Tyler Banks, Marcus's friend from high school back in Ohio, a wildlife photographer with a gentle, self-deprecating humor and absolutely no technical climbing experience. Tyler was 30, stocky and freckled, with a mop of sandy hair that never seemed to sit flat, and a habit of laughing at his own jokes before he finished telling them. He had come to Alaska on Marcus's invitation, partly to document the expedition with his cameras, and partly because he had just ended a long relationship and needed to be somewhere vast and empty for a while. His role was straightforward: stay at base camp, manage the satellite communication system, and be there when they came back down. He accepted this role without complaint, though Marcus caught him staring up at the ridge more than once, with an expression that was equal parts awe and relief that he would not be going up there. They climbed in alpine style, which meant they carried everything on their backs and moved fast with no fixed ropes, no supplemental oxygen, and no support team waiting at intermediate camps. It was the purest and most dangerous way to climb a big mountain. If something went wrong above base camp, they were on their own. The nearest rescue service was in Anchorage, over 200 kilometers away, and even under perfect conditions a helicopter would take hours to reach them, assuming the weather allowed flight at all. Dylan had explained all of this to Marcus many times, and Marcus had understood it the way he understood engineering tolerances, as an acceptable margin of risk calculated against the reward. The night before they left base camp, the three of them sat around a small gas stove inside the mess tent, eating rehydrated pasta and drinking instant coffee that tasted like it had been brewed from dirt. Dylan spread a topographic map across the floor and traced their planned route with his finger, narrating each section in his calm, methodical way. 2 days up to the high camp at around 4,800 meters, 1 day for the summit push, 2 days back down if everything went well. Tyler looked at the map, and then looked at the ridge visible through the tent's open flap, its upper reaches disappearing into a band of cloud that glowed faintly in the late Arctic twilight. He asked if they had communication equipment that would work up there. Dylan pointed to the satellite radio clipped to his pack and said it would function when the weather allowed a clear signal, but above a certain altitude and inside a storm, they should assume they were unreachable. Up there, he said, they had each other, and that was it. Marcus said little that evening. He sat with his back against his pack, turning a small photograph between his fingers. It was a picture of Lauren taken 6 months earlier at a friend's barbecue, her hair loose around her shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. She was 5 months pregnant in the photo, though it barely showed. Now she was 7 months along, living in their small house in Anchorage, tracking his position each night through the satellite messenger's GPS coordinates that updated on an app on her phone. She had driven him to the airport 3 days ago, standing at the curb with her hand resting on her belly, and she had not cried, because Lauren was not someone who cried in public. She was 31, a high school biology teacher with steady hands and a practical mind and a stubbornness that matched Marcus's own. She supported his climbing because she understood that it was part of who he was, the same way her students and her garden and her insistence on reading before bed were part of who she was. But before he walked through the security gate, she had taken his hand and held it and said something she had never said before any of his previous expeditions. No matter what happens up there, you come home. Your child needs a father. Marcus had leaned down and kissed her forehead and said, "I promise." He said it the way he meant it, which was completely. Now, sitting in the tent at 3,200 meters with the mountain looming above him and the photograph in his hands, he folded it carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. Dylan looked over and said nothing, because he had known Marcus long enough to recognize the moments when words were unnecessary. Tyler, sensing the quiet, busied himself with adjusting his camera settings. Outside, the wind picked up and the tent walls shuddered, and somewhere far above them the mountain waited in the dark.
They left base camp before dawn, headlamps cutting narrow beams into the dark. Tyler stood outside the mess tent in his down jacket, arms crossed against the cold, watching their lights move upward like two small stars drifting away from the earth. He raised a hand, though he knew they couldn't see him, and stayed there until the lights disappeared behind the first ice buttress. Then he went back inside, poured himself coffee, and sat down with his radio and his cameras, and the particular kind of silence that fills a place when the people you care about have walked into danger, and all you can do is wait.
The first day on the ridge was brutal. The ice face above base camp rose at nearly 70 degrees, a sheer wall of blue-white ice that required every tool they carried. Axes, crampons, ice screws placed every few meters as protection against a fall.
Dylan led most of the pitches, kicking the front points of his crampons into the ice with precise, rhythmic strikes, testing each placement before committing his weight. Marcus followed, cleaning the screws as he climbed, his pack heavy with the gear they would need higher up. The snow on the ridge was unstable, layered in wind slabs that could fracture without warning and send thousands of pounds of compressed snow sliding down the face.
Dylan probed ahead with his axe before each step, reading the texture and density of the surface the way a doctor reads a pulse. Twice he stopped and rerouted them around sections that felt hollow underfoot, where the snow bridged hidden gaps between the ice and the rock beneath. The wind was constant and vicious, gusting to 60 miles an hour and driving ice crystals into every exposed inch of skin. Marcus pulled his balaclava higher and tightened his goggles, but the cold still found its way in, seeping through seams and zippers and settling into his fingers and toes, with a numbness that made every grip uncertain. By late afternoon, they had gained nearly 1,000 meters of elevation and reached a steep section of the ridge where the angle eased just enough to allow them to stop. Dylan chose a spot on the leeward side of a snow formation, and they began digging a snow cave, hacking at the compacted surface with their axes and scooping out blocks with their gloved hands. It took over an hour to carve a space large enough for two people to lie side by side. Inside, sheltered from the wind, the temperature hovered around -15 Celsius, which felt almost warm compared to the exposed ridge. They crawled into their sleeping bags without removing their boots and ate cold rations, energy bars and dried fruit and a few strips of jerky, because lighting the stove in the confined space risked carbon monoxide buildup, and neither of them wanted to die stupidly after surviving the climb. Marcus lay in the dark, listening to the mountain. The sounds were constant and deeply unsettling. Low groans that came from somewhere beneath them as the glacier shifted under its own weight. Sharp cracks that echoed across the face like gunshots as ice fractured in the cold, and the ceaseless howl of wind above their shelter that rose and fell like breathing. He thought about Lauren. He wondered if she was asleep, or if she was sitting up in bed with her phone in her hand, watching the GPS dot on her screen that marked his position. He wondered if the dot was still updating, or if the storm had cut the signal. He reached into his jacket and touched the photograph against his chest, and closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But every sound pulled him back, reminding him where he was and how far he was from everything that mattered. Dylan slept in short fragments, waking every hour to check the conditions outside. He had trained himself years ago to function on broken sleep during expeditions, a skill born not from discipline, but from a deep, almost instinctive alertness that never fully shut off when he was on a mountain. He knew this ridge better than Marcus did, at least in theory, and he knew that the section above them, a narrow snow arête leading to the summit pyramid, was the most dangerous part of the route. The arête was exposed on both sides, with drops of over 1,000 meters to the glaciers below, and the snow along its crest could be corniced, overhanging lips of wind-packed snow that looked solid, but could collapse under a climber's weight without warning. He had told Marcus about this before they left, in his calm, factual way, and Marcus had nodded and said he understood. But understanding a thing in a warm room with a map on the table was different from understanding it at 5,000 meters with the wind trying to peel you off the mountain. The second day was harder. They climbed the arête in conditions that tested every ounce of skill and nerve they possessed. The ridge was barely wider than a sidewalk in places, falling away sharply on both sides into white emptiness. Marcus moved with exaggerated care, planting each foot deliberately, keeping his center of gravity low, trying not to look at the exposure. Dylan moved ahead, probing for cornices, occasionally driving his axe deep into the snow to test its integrity. At one point, a section of the cornice to their left fractured and fell away, a slab the size of a car door tumbling silently into the void below. They both froze, watching it disappear, then continued without speaking. On the afternoon of the third day, they stood on the summit of Mount Kaskawulsh. The sky above them was impossibly blue, scrubbed clean by the wind, and the entire St. Elias range spread beneath them in every direction, an ocean of white peaks and glacial valleys that seemed to extend beyond the curvature of the earth. Dylan grabbed Marcus by the shoulders and pulled him into a rough embrace, and they both shouted into the wind, wordless sounds of triumph and relief that were swallowed instantly by the vastness around them. Marcus pulled out a small camera and took a photograph of Dylan standing against the sky, grinning through his frosted beard, and then Dylan took one of Marcus, who held up the photograph of Lauren like a small flag. But the joy lasted less than 5 minutes. Dylan saw it first, a wall of dark cloud building rapidly to the west, dense and heavy and moving with a speed that made his stomach drop. He had seen fronts like this before in the St. Elias, massive Pacific storms that could engulf a mountain in under an hour and trap climbers in whiteout conditions for days. He turned to Marcus, and the grin was gone from his face. "We need to go down now," he said, his voice carrying an urgency that Marcus had never heard from him before. "We don't have time." They descended the east ridge, the only viable route to lose altitude quickly. The snow was firm but steep, and they moved in a careful rhythm, Dylan below and Marcus above, connected by 50 meters of rope. Marcus was tired, his legs heavy from 3 days of climbing, his concentration fraying at the edges. 40 minutes below the summit, he stepped onto what looked like solid snow covering the ridge. The surface held for a fraction of a second, then collapsed. Beneath it was a hidden crevasse, a crack in the glacier concealed by a thin snow bridge that had looked no different from the ground on either side. Marcus dropped instantly, 4 meters into the gap before the rope snapped tight against the anchor Dylan had set. The jolt stopped his fall, but drove his right leg straight into a ledge of solid ice. The sound was unmistakable, a wet, grinding crack that cut through the wind like a scream. His shin bone had been driven upward through his knee joint, shattering the kneecap and compressing the bones together in a way that destroyed the joint completely. Marcus screamed. The pain was not like anything he had experienced or imagined, a white-hot current that shot from his leg up through his spine and exploded behind his eyes. Dylan hauled him up out of the crevasse, working fast, pulling rope hand over hand until Marcus's body cleared the lip. He looked at Marcus's leg and saw the unnatural angle, the way the lower leg seemed to have shortened, the bulge beneath the fabric where bone pressed against skin. He knew what it meant. A shattered knee at 5,600 meters, no rescue team, a storm arriving within the hour. In the unwritten rules of high-altitude climbing, this was the moment when a partner could walk away. No one would blame him. The mountain had made its judgment, and the living were expected to save themselves. Dylan looked at Marcus, whose face was gray and contorted, whose hands were gripping the snow as if the earth itself might drop away. Then he looked down the ridge, at the long white line descending into cloud. He said 5 words. "I'm not leaving you here." Far below, and hundreds of kilometers to the south, in a small house on a quiet street in Anchorage, Lauren Reed sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone. The last message from Marcus had arrived at 3:47 that afternoon. Summited, heading down. "Love you." After that, nothing. The GPS tracker on her app showed his position frozen at a point just below the summit, the dot unmoving, the timestamp stuck. She refreshed the screen. Nothing. She refreshed again. The dot did not move. She called Tyler on the satellite phone, her voice steady in the way it always was when she was most afraid. Tyler answered after 4 rings and told her that he had lost contact with both of them since mid-afternoon. A major storm was moving across the upper mountain. He said he was sure they were fine, that they had probably descended below the signal range, that Dylan knew what he was doing. Lauren thanked him and hung up, and sat very still in the kitchen with her hand on her belly, feeling her child move inside her, and stared at the frozen dot on the screen until the light outside the window faded to black.
Dylan worked fast because he had no choice. The storm was closing in from the west, the light was failing, and Marcus was sitting in the snow with his leg bent at an angle that made Dylan's stomach turn every time he looked at it. He needed a plan, and he needed it now. He crouched beside Marcus and spoke in a low, steady voice, the same voice he used when guiding nervous clients on technical routes, the voice that said everything is under control, even when it wasn't.
He told Marcus he was going to lower him down the mountain using their rope. He would tie 2 50-meter lengths together, anchor himself to an ice screw, and let Marcus slide down the slope in controlled descents. At the end of each rope length, Dylan would climb down, set a new anchor, and repeat. It would be slow. It would be painful. But it was the only way. Marcus nodded. His face was the color of old cement, and his jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in his temples stood out like cords. He did not ask how long it would take, or whether it would work, because those questions had no useful answers, and asking them would only waste the energy he needed to survive the next hour. Dylan rigged a makeshift harness around Marcus's torso, using a sling and a carabiner, checked the knots twice, then drove an ice screw into the slope and clipped the rope through it. He eased Marcus over the edge and began to pay out the rope, feeding it through his gloved hands meter by meter, feeling Marcus's weight pull against him like an anchor dragging through water. The first lowering took nearly an hour. The slope was steep, maybe 55 degrees, and the surface alternated between hard ice and loose snow that gave way without warning. Marcus tried to control his descent by braking with his good leg and his ice axe, but every bump and irregularity in the terrain sent shockwaves through his shattered knee. The pain came in surges so intense that his vision whited out, and he had to bite down on the collar of his jacket to keep from screaming. He bit until his gums bled, tasting copper and salt, and gripped the rope so hard that his gloves tore at the palms. When he reached the end of the rope length, he lay in the snow, gasping, unable to move, while Dylan climbed down to him, retrieved the screw, set a new one, and prepared for the next descent. Neither of them spoke except when necessary. There was nothing to say that the mountain was not already saying louder. By the 4th lowering, the storm arrived. It did not build gradually. It came like a wall, a sudden whiteout of driven snow and wind that reduced visibility to less than an arm's length. The temperature, already brutal, plummeted to -35°C. Dylan could no longer see Marcus below him. He could only feel the weight on the rope, the slow tug and release that meant Marcus was still moving, still alive. He counted seconds to estimate distance, paying out rope in a rhythm that became mechanical, almost hypnotic. His hands had lost all feeling an hour ago. He operated them by looking at them, watching his fingers grip and release, trusting his eyes to do what his nerves no longer could. The 5th lowering. The 6th. The 7th. Each one slower than the last, each one draining a little more from both of them. Dylan's arms burned with the kind of deep muscular exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from effort sustained far beyond its natural limit. He had not slept in over 30 hours. He had eaten half an energy bar since morning. His body was consuming itself for fuel, breaking down muscle and fat to keep his core temperature from dropping below the point of no return. He knew the signs of hypothermia, the clumsiness, the confusion, the dangerous warmth that crept in just before the end, and he monitored himself with the same clinical attention he gave to the anchors and the rope. Not yet, he told himself, not yet. On the 8th lowering, everything went wrong. Dylan felt the rope run out smoothly for the first 40 meters, Marcus's weight steady and predictable. Then the weight changed. It became heavier, more abrupt, as if Marcus had fallen rather than slid. The rope jerked tight and stayed tight, vibrating with a tension that Dylan could feel through his gloves and into his forearms. Marcus had slipped over a rock overhang, a cliff band hidden beneath the snow that jutted out from the face like a shelf, and was now hanging in open air, spinning slowly at the end of the rope with nothing beneath him but a drop into darkness. His broken leg dangled uselessly, his hands clawed at the rope above him, but there was no wall to push against, no ice to kick into, nothing but empty space and the wind screaming past his ears. He shouted Dylan's name, but the storm swallowed it whole. He shouted again, and heard nothing back. He was alone in the dark, suspended between the mountain and the void, and for the first time since the accident he understood with complete clarity that he was going to die. Above the overhang, Dylan felt the rope lock and knew something was wrong. The weight was dead weight now, no movement, no tugging, no signal. He pulled. The rope did not give. He pulled harder, leaning back against the slope, driving his crampons into the ice, hauling with everything he had. Marcus did not move. Dylan was strong, but Marcus weighed nearly 80 kilograms with his gear, and pulling a dead weight upward against gravity on a steep ice face in a blizzard was beyond what any single human body could do. The ice screw that served as his anchor began to shift. He felt it first as a subtle vibration, then as a slow, sickening rotation as the metal twisted in the ice under the combined load. The screw was pulling out. If it failed, both of them would fall. Dylan braced his feet and held. Minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe 30. Time had stopped meaning anything. The cold was inside him now, not just on his skin but in his blood, in his thoughts, slowing everything down to a crawl. His legs shook uncontrollably, his arms were locked in position, but he could feel the strength draining from them like water from a cracked vessel. He was sliding. Centimeter by centimeter, the weight below was dragging him toward the edge. He dug his crampons deeper, but the ice was brittle and fractured under the pressure. He knew, with the same engineering certainty that Marcus would have recognized, that the physics of this situation had only one outcome. If he held on, the anchor would fail, or his body would give out, and both of them would go over the edge. If he let go, the same thing would happen, only faster. There was only one action that could save at least one life. He reached for the knife on his harness. His fingers were so numb that it took 3 attempts to unclip it from the loop. The handle was cold and hard, and felt like it belonged to someone else's hand. He called Marcus's name one last time, his voice cracking, barely audible even to himself. The storm answered with nothing. Dylan pressed the blade against the rope. The fibers were taut, humming with tension. He sawed once, twice, and on the 3rd stroke the rope parted with a sound like a gasp. The weight vanished, the rope whipped upward past his face and fell limp across the snow. Dylan collapsed backward, his body suddenly weightless, his chest heaving. He lay on his back on the slope and stared up into the black sky where the snow fell endlessly out of nothing, and a sound came out of him that was not a word, a raw, broken noise that the wind carried away before it could become anything. He lay there for a long time. Then he pressed his face into the snow and wept, the sobs shaking his entire body, because he believed with absolute certainty that he had just killed his best friend. In Anchorage, 700 kilometers to the south, Lauren sat in the living room of their small house on Birch Street. The lights were off except for the glow of her phone on the coffee table. The satellite messenger app showed the same frozen dot it had shown for hours, a tiny blue circle pinned to the mountain like a thumbtack on a map, motionless and mute. She had called Tyler again at 10 o'clock, and he had told her the same thing. No contact. The storm was severe. They should not assume the worst. She had thanked him and hung up and sat very still with her hands on her belly and the phone's light reflecting in her eyes. At midnight, she called the Alaska Rescue Coordination Center. The dispatcher, a woman with a calm professional voice, told her that no aircraft could fly in the current conditions. The storm system was massive and slow-moving. The earliest a helicopter could launch would be 48 hours, possibly longer. Lauren asked what she should do. The dispatcher paused and said she should try to rest, that they would call her the moment conditions changed. Lauren set the phone down and stared at it. Then she picked it up again and dialed a number in Fairbanks. Robert Reed answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep but alert in the way that former military men wake, instantly, completely. Robert was 63, a retired Army helicopter pilot who had spent 25 years flying rescue missions across Alaska's most unforgiving terrain before a bad knee and a cardiologist's warning forced him to stop. He was tall and gaunt, with close-cropped silver hair and the weathered face of a man who had spent more of his life in the wind than out of it. He had never fully approved of Marcus's climbing, not because he didn't understand the impulse, but because he understood it too well, and he knew what mountains could do to the people who loved them. Lauren told him everything she knew in 3 short sentences. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm driving down now. We'll find my son."
Marcus did not remember the fall. One moment there was the rope, taut and humming against his harness, the only thing connecting him to Dylan and to life. The next moment there was nothing. A sudden weightlessness, a rush of cold air, and then an impact so violent that it drove every molecule of breath from his lungs and replaced it with a pain so complete that his body simply shut down. He did not scream, he did not move. He lay on his back in absolute darkness, mouth open, eyes open, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, except a high, thin ringing in his ears and the slow, wet sound of his own breathing.
He did not know how long he lay there before his mind began to function again. It could have been minutes, or it could have been an hour. The first thing he became aware of was the cold, not the surface cold of wind and snow, but a deeper, more permanent cold that radiated from the ice beneath him and seeped into his body like water filling a hole. The second thing was the pain. His right leg, already shattered at the knee, had absorbed the full force of the impact. The swelling had doubled, the joint ballooning inside his pants until the fabric stretched tight as a drum. But there was a new pain now, a sharp, stabbing sensation on his left side that flared with every breath. He pressed his hand against his ribs and felt something shift beneath the skin, a grinding movement that sent a bolt of white heat through his chest. Broken ribs, at least 2, maybe 3. Every inhale was a small act of violence against himself. He lay still and tried to think. The darkness around him was total, the kind of darkness that has weight and texture, that presses against your open eyes and makes you wonder if you have gone blind. He could feel the surface beneath him, ice, uneven and hard, maybe 1.5 meters wide. He reached out with his left hand and found the edge almost immediately. Beyond it, his fingers closed on nothing. He pulled his hand back. He reached to the right and found the wall of the crevasse, a vertical sheet of ice so cold that his bare fingertips stuck to it for a fraction of a second before he jerked them away. He was on a ledge, a shelf of ice inside a glacial crevasse, and below him was a depth he could not see and did not want to imagine. Marcus remembered the headlamp. His hand went to his jacket pocket, the small LED light he always carried as backup, a habit Dylan had drilled into him years ago. He found it, pulled it out, and pressed the switch. The beam was narrow and blue-white, cutting through the darkness like a blade. He pointed it upward first. The walls of the crevasse rose on either side, blue and gray and ancient, streaked with bands of compressed snow that recorded centuries of accumulation. The opening above, the place where he had fallen through, was a jagged slot of slightly less dark, impossibly far away. 25 meters, maybe more. With 2 good legs and climbing gear, it would have been a difficult ascent. With a shattered knee and broken ribs, it was not difficult. It was impossible. He pointed the light downward. The crevasse narrowed beneath his ledge, the walls tapering toward each other like the inside of a funnel. He could see perhaps 15 meters before the beam lost its strength against the dark. The depth below was unknowable. But then he saw something that made his heart beat so hard he could feel it in his broken ribs. Down and to the left, where the crevasse walls pinched together at a steep angle, there was light. Not much, a faint, pale glow, barely distinguishable from the ice around it. The kind of light that might be reflected daylight, filtering through thin ice at the glacier's edge. It could mean nothing. A trick of the ice, an internal reflection, a pocket of translucent snow. Or it could mean everything. It could mean a way out. He understood the choice with the clarity that extreme situations sometimes impose. He could stay on this ledge. He had no food, no water, no way to signal for help. The headlamp battery would last a few hours at most. After that, there would be only cold and dark, and the slow process of dying. Or he could descend deeper into the crevasse, toward a light that might not be real, down a route that might end in a dead drop, or a space too narrow to pass through. Every survival instinct in his body told him to stay where he was, to cling to the solid ground beneath him, to wait. Going deeper was madness. Going deeper meant choosing the void over the known. But staying meant choosing death over the possibility of life. And Marcus had made a promise. He thought about Lauren. He saw her standing at the airport curb, her hand on her belly, her eyes steady and dry. He heard her voice. "You come home." He thought about the child inside her, the child he had not yet met, whose face he had tried to imagine on 100 different nights. He thought about his father, Robert, who had spent 25 years flying into storms to bring people home, and who would never forgive a mountain for taking his son. And he thought about Dylan, somewhere above him in the storm, who had made the hardest decision of his life to keep himself alive. Marcus would not let that decision be wasted. He tied the remnant of cut rope, maybe 10 meters, around his waist, looped it through a carabiner still clipped to his harness, and found a small nub of ice on the wall that could serve as a friction point. Then he began to lower himself. The movement was agonizing beyond description. Each shift of his body sent his broken leg swinging against the ice wall. Each breath drove his fractured ribs against his lungs. He descended in increments, measured in centimeters, breaking with his good leg against one wall while feeding rope through the carabiner. Twice his hand slipped, and he dropped in free fall, 2 meters, maybe 3, before the rope caught, and the jolt slammed through his body like an electric shock. He screamed both times, and the crevasse threw his voice back at him from every direction, multiplied and distorted, as if the mountain were mocking him for trying. The headlamp began to flicker after the second hour. He switched it off to conserve what remained and descended in darkness, navigating by touch alone, feeling the walls with his hands, judging the width of the crevasse by the echo of his own ragged breathing. The light below grew stronger. What had been a faint glow became a definite brightness, warm and golden, unmistakably daylight. He moved toward it with a desperation that overrode the pain, pulling himself along the narrowing walls, squeezing through gaps where the ice pressed against his chest and back simultaneously. After nearly 4 hours, the crevasse opened. The walls fell away on one side, and Marcus found himself at the edge of the glacier, where ancient ice met the rocky moraine below. Sunlight poured through the gap, raw, blinding, overwhelming. He dragged himself through the opening on his stomach, his broken leg trailing behind him like something that no longer belonged to his body, and collapsed face down on bare rock. The warmth of the sun hit his back, and he lay there unable to move, tears running sideways across his face into the gravel. He could not cry properly because his broken ribs would not allow the convulsion that crying required, so the grief and relief came out in small, silent shudders that shook his shoulders and nothing else. He was out, he was alive. And he was alone on a glacier with a destroyed leg, no food, no water, and 9 kilometers between him and base camp. While Marcus lay bleeding on the moraine, Dylan was descending the mountain alone. The storm had begun to ease sometime before dawn, the wind dropping from a roar to a moan, the snow thinning until he could see 20 meters ahead. He moved mechanically, placing one foot in front of the other with the blank efficiency of a machine running on its last reserves. His body was shutting down. He knew the signs. His thoughts came slowly, as if filtered through heavy cloth. His hands trembled constantly. He stumbled every few steps, catching himself on his axe, then stumbling again. But the physical deterioration was nothing compared to what was happening inside his mind. Every few minutes, the memory returned. The vibration of the knife against the rope, the sudden release of tension, the silence that followed. He replayed it endlessly, examining it from every angle, searching for the alternative he had not taken, the solution he had missed. There was none. He knew there was none. But knowing did not stop the replay, and it did not stop the guilt that sat in his chest like a stone. He reached base camp after 14 hours of continuous descent. Tyler saw him coming from a distance, a single figure moving slowly across the glacier, hunched and staggering. Tyler ran out to meet him, his boots crunching on the ice, his face already tight with the question he was afraid to ask. "Where's Marcus?" Dylan stopped walking. He looked at Tyler and his mouth opened, but no words came. His legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees on the ice. Tyler understood. He stood there for a moment, his hands at his sides, his breath visible in the cold air. Then he knelt beside Dylan and put his arms around him and held him while the silence between them said everything that words could not. They stayed like that for a long time. Eventually Dylan spoke, his voice fractured and hollow, and told Tyler what had happened. The lowering, the overhang, the weight, the rope, the knife. Tyler listened without interrupting. When Dylan finished, Tyler said nothing for another minute. Then he said, "You did what you had to do." Dylan shook his head but did not argue. Tyler helped Dylan into the mess tent, gave him water and food, and wrapped him in a sleeping bag. Then he went to the satellite phone. His hands were shaking as he keyed in the number for the Rescue Coordination Center. He reported that one climber had returned to base camp, and that the second climber, Marcus Reed, had fallen into a crevasse on the upper mountain and was presumed dead. The dispatcher asked for coordinates, and Tyler gave them as best he could. Then he called Lauren. He had rehearsed what to say in his head, calm, factual, measured, but when he heard her voice, the rehearsal dissolved. He told her that Marcus had been in an accident, that he had fallen, that they had lost contact. He did not say the word dead. He could not. Lauren listened in silence. When Tyler finished, she asked one question. "Is there any chance he's alive?" Tyler hesitated. Then he said, "I don't know." Lauren hung up. She did not sit down. She did not cry. She picked up her keys, her coat, and the folder she had prepared 3 days ago, the one containing Marcus's route map, the last GPS coordinates from his satellite device, and his medical records including his blood type and known allergies. She drove across Anchorage to the Alaska Air Rescue Service headquarters on Merrill Field, a low concrete building with a radio tower on the roof and a row of helicopters parked on the tarmac behind chain-link fencing. The receptionist, a young man barely out of his 20s, told her the operations commander was in a briefing. Lauren said she would wait. She sat in the plastic chair in the hallway for 40 minutes, her back straight, her hands folded over the folder on her lap, until a door opened and a man walked out. Frank Delgado was 51, compact and broad-chested, with a thick black mustache going gray at the edges, and the unhurried walk of someone who had managed emergencies for so long that urgency no longer showed on the outside. He had been coordinating mountain rescues in Alaska for 18 years, and had learned early that the families were often harder to face than the mountains. He looked at Lauren, 7 months pregnant, standing up from the chair with the folder already extended, and something in her expression told him this was not a woman who would accept being told to go home and wait. She laid the folder open on the nearest table and walked him through everything. The route, the timeline, the last known position, the storm window. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She presented the information the way her husband would have presented an engineering problem, clearly, logically, and with the implicit expectation that a solution existed and would be found. Delgado studied the map, checked the weather updates on his phone, and looked at her. "The storm breaks in about 12 hours, he said. "We'll fly the moment we can." Robert Reed arrived in Anchorage late that night. He pulled into Lauren's driveway in a mud-spattered truck, his face drawn and pale under the porch light. Lauren opened the door before he knocked. They embraced briefly. Robert was not a man who lingered in emotion, and went inside. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Lauren told him everything. Robert listened with the focused stillness of a man accustomed to processing bad news quickly and converting it into action. When she finished, he pulled out his own phone and dialed a number from memory. The voice that answered belonged to Hank Morrison, 47, a civilian helicopter pilot who ran a small charter operation out of Palmer, 20 miles north of Anchorage. Hank was wiry and quiet, with receding hair and the kind of pale blue eyes that seemed to be permanently squinting against glare. He had flown bush planes since he was 19 and helicopters since he was 24, and there was no terrain in southern Alaska that he had not seen from the air. Robert had flown with him on a half-dozen rescue missions before retirement and trusted him more than any pilot still active. Robert explained the situation in 3 sentences. Hank was quiet for a moment, then said, "I can be wheels up at first light if the ceiling lifts." Robert thanked him and hung up. He looked at Lauren across the table. She was holding her coffee with both hands, staring at the steam rising from the surface. "We'll find him," Robert said. Lauren nodded, but did not look up.
Marcus began crawling at midday. The sun was high, and the glacier spread before him like a white desert, blinding and featureless, stretching 9 kilometers to the place where he had last seen the orange tents of base camp.
9 kilometers. On a good day, with 2 working legs and a light pack, he could cover that distance in 3 hours. Now, dragging himself forward on his hands and his left knee, with his shattered right leg trailing behind him like a broken rudder, he estimated that he could move at roughly 100 meters per hour. If he did not stop, if he did not pass out, if he did not fall into another crevasse, it would take him 90 hours, nearly 4 days. He did not have 4 days. He probably did not have 2. He stopped calculating. Calculation was the enemy now, the part of his engineer's brain that wanted to reduce survival to numbers and find that the numbers did not work. Instead, he looked at the glacier ahead of him and picked out a rock, a dark stone sitting on the ice maybe 30 meters away, and said to himself, "That rock in 20 minutes. Nothing else existed. Not the 9 kilometers.
He
not the
stopped
broken
calculating.
leg. Not
Calculation
the thirst that
was
was
the
already
enemy
thickening
now,
his
the
tongue
part of his
and cracking
engineer's
his
brain
lips.
that wanted to
Just
reduce
the
survival
rock.
to numbers.
Just
and
20
find
minutes.
that the numbers did not work.
He reached it in 25.
Instead, he looked at the
He
glacier
lay
ahead of
beside
him
it,
and picked out a
panting.
rock,
His hands
a dark
raw from
stone
gripping
sitting on
the
the
ice.
ice, maybe
His
30
left knee
meters away.
bruised and bleeding
Said
through
to
his
himself,
torn pants.
"That rock
Then he
in
raised
20
his
minutes.
head, found another rock.
Nothing else existed.
And began again.
Not the 9 kilometers.
The first
not the
day
broken
was the
leg,
glacier.
Not the thirst.
The
that
surface
was already
uneven,
thickening his tongue, and
ridged
cracking
and
his lips.
cracked, with meltwater
Just the
channels
rock.
cutting shallow
Just
grooves
20
into the
minutes.
ice that caught his knee and his hands and slowed him further. The crevasses were the worst. Some were narrow enough to crawl across, his weight distributed on his belly, holding his breath until he reached the other side. Others were too wide and he had to detour around them, adding hundreds of meters to a journey that was already impossibly long. He came to one crevasse that was maybe 2 meters across, with a thin snow bridge spanning it that might or might not hold his weight. He lay at the edge and stared at it for 10 minutes, trying to judge the thickness, the density, the probability. Then he lowered himself onto the bridge and crawled across on his stomach, moving as slowly and as lightly as he could, feeling the snow flex beneath him like a living thing. It held. He reached the other side and vomited from the adrenaline, though there was nothing in his stomach to bring up. In the late afternoon, his left crampon caught in a shallow meltwater groove, and he pitched forward into a trough of ice no deeper than a bathtub. But with his broken leg immobilized and his ribs screaming at every twist, getting out of even a shallow depression became an ordeal that lasted nearly an hour. He wedged his ice axe into the lip of the trough and pulled himself up centimeter by centimeter, his arms shaking with exhaustion, his breath coming in short gasps that sent fire through his fractured ribs. By the time he was free, the sun was low, and the temperature was dropping. The only water he had was the snow he stuffed into his mouth, letting it melt slowly on his swollen tongue. It was not enough. It was never enough. His urine had turned dark brown that morning, a sign of severe dehydration that any wilderness medic would recognize as dangerous. The second day, he reached the moraine. The transition from ice to rock should have been a relief, but it was worse. The moraine was a chaos of loose stones ranging in size from fists to automobiles, sharp-edged and unstable, deposited over centuries by the retreating glacier. Every surface was tilted, uneven, treacherous. Marcus could not crawl over it on his hands and knees the way he had on the ice. Instead, he had to drag himself from boulder to boulder, pulling his body up and over each obstacle, letting his broken leg bump and scrape against the rock below. Each impact sent a shockwave through the shattered joint that reached his brain as a blinding white flash. He screamed the first dozen times. Then he stopped screaming because his throat was too raw and too dry to produce the sound. He began to talk instead, not to himself, but to Lauren. He told her about the rocks, about the pain, about the color of the sky. He described the way the light fell across the moraine in the late afternoon, turning the gray stones gold. He told her he was coming home. He told her about the baby's room he was going to paint when he got back. Yellow, they had decided, because yellow was hopeful. He spoke in a continuous, rambling monologue that made no distinction between the real and the imagined, because Lauren was not there, but she was also the most present thing in his world, more real than the rocks, more real than the pain. By evening of the second day, he began to hallucinate. He heard the baby crying, a thin, high sound that came from somewhere behind him and made him twist around to look, seeing nothing but stone and sky. He heard Lauren's voice calling his name from a direction he could not identify. And then a song started. It arrived without warning, as if someone had switched on a radio inside his skull. Don't Stop Believin' by Journey. The opening piano riff followed by the bass line, looping endlessly. He had not thought about this song in years. He had no particular attachment to it. But now it played on repeat with a clarity and persistence that was almost maddening, and he found that his body began to move in time with it. Each beat became a motion. Plant the left hand, drag forward. Plant the right hand, drag forward. The song became a metronome, and the metronome became the only thing keeping him from lying down and letting the cold take him. The second night was the closest he came to dying. The temperature dropped below -20, and he had no shelter, no sleeping bag, nothing but the torn remnants of his climbing clothes. He wedged himself into a narrow gap between two boulders, pulling his arms inside his jacket and curling his body as tight as his broken ribs allowed. The shivering was violent and uncontrollable, his teeth chattering so hard that he thought they might crack. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph of Lauren. It was damp and creased, the colors fading, her face barely visible in the darkness. He pressed it against his chest, over his heart, and whispered into the cold air, "I'm coming back, I promised." He did not sleep. He drifted in and out of a gray half-consciousness that was neither sleep nor waking but something in between, a state where the cold was a sound, and the pain was a color, and time moved in directions that did not make sense. He saw his father's face. He saw the nursery they had not yet finished. He saw Dylan cutting the rope, and understood, even through the delirium, that Dylan had saved his own life, and that this was right and necessary, and that he would tell him so, if he ever got the chance. Dawn came gray and cold, and Marcus forced himself to move. His body did not want to cooperate. His arms felt like they belonged to someone else. His left knee was swollen and purple from 2 days of bearing his full weight against rock and ice. But he moved. He planted his hands, and he dragged himself forward because stopping meant dying, and he was not ready to die. The song was still playing in his head. It had not stopped all night, and he crawled in time with it, beat by beat, rock by rock. Mid-morning the fog began to thin, and Marcus raised his head and saw color. Orange. 2 points of orange against the gray-brown moraine, maybe a kilometer ahead and slightly below him. The tents. Base camp. His heart lurched so violently that black spots swam across his vision, and he nearly passed out. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone and breathed, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Then he looked again. The orange was still there, real and solid and unmistakable. But the camp was silent. No smoke from the stove. No figures moving between the tents. No sound of voices carried on the wind. A new fear replaced the old one. The fear that Dylan and Tyler had already left, that they had packed up and gone down, believing him dead, and that he had crawled for 3 days across a glacier and a moraine to reach an empty camp. He used everything he had left. He opened his mouth and screamed. The sound that came out was barely human, a hoarse, shredded rasp that tore through his dry throat and tasted of blood. It carried maybe 50 meters before the wind smothered it. He screamed again, louder, feeling something tear in his throat, tasting iron, and again, and again. Each scream weaker than the last, each one costing something that he could not afford to spend but spent anyway, because silence meant invisibility, and invisibility meant death. He screamed until his voice broke completely, and nothing came out but a wet, gurgling whisper, and then he lay face down on the rocks and waited for whatever would come next. In the tents below, Dylan had not slept for 2 nights. He lay in his sleeping bag with his eyes open, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the wind and hearing the rope snap over and over in his memory. Tyler had tried to talk to him, had offered food and water and conversation, but Dylan responded in monosyllables, and eventually Tyler stopped trying. They had agreed to leave the next morning. There was nothing left to stay for. The rescue center had been notified. The coordinates had been given. Marcus was gone, and the mountain did not give back what it took. That night, Dylan sat up in his sleeping bag and pulled out a small notebook from his pack. He began to write a letter to Marcus's family, to Lauren, to Robert, to the child who would never know its father. He tried to explain the rope, the decision, the impossible arithmetic of survival that had left him alive, and Marcus dead. He wrote 3 pages, read them, and tore them out. The words were wrong. They were all wrong. He tried again, and again the words failed, and he tore those pages out too. He sat with the empty notebook in his hands, and the torn pages scattered around his sleeping bag, and understood that there was no combination of words in any language that could make this right. He put the notebook away, and lay back down, and stared at the ceiling until morning. At first light, Tyler began breaking down the mess tent. Dylan moved slowly, mechanically, stuffing gear into bags with the vacant efficiency of someone performing a task they no longer believed in. They worked in silence. The packs were nearly ready when Hank Morrison's helicopter lifted off from Palmer Airfield, 60 kilometers south of base camp. The storm had broken overnight, and the sky was clear for the first time in days. Hank flew north along the glacier corridor, his pale blue eyes scanning the terrain below through the bubble canopy. Beside him sat a paramedic named Corinne Voss, 34, compact and serious, with short dark hair tucked under a flight helmet and the quiet competence of someone who had pulled broken people off mountains for a decade. Robert had stayed in Anchorage with Lauren at her insistence, monitoring the flight on a handheld radio, his knuckles white around the plastic casing. Lauren sat beside him at the kitchen table, both hands on her belly, listening to the static and the occasional burst of Hank's voice reporting coordinates and visibility. She had not slept in 3 days, She had not cried. She held herself together with the same force of will that her husband was using to hold himself together on the mountain, though neither of them knew it.
Dylan heard the sound first as wind. It was faint, formless, the kind of noise the mountain made 100 times a day. Air moving through gaps in rock, ice settling under its own weight, the creak and groan of a landscape that was never truly still. He was inside the tent, kneeling beside his pack, stuffing a compression sack into the top compartment with the mechanical detachment of someone performing the last rituals of a task he wished he never had to finish. Tyler was outside, collapsing the mess tent, pulling stakes from the frozen ground with short, sharp tugs.
They had agreed to leave by 8. It was 1:45. In 15 minutes, they would shoulder their packs and begin the long walk down the glacier to the airstrip at the valley floor, and the mountain would keep what it had taken, and the orange tents that had been Marcus's last known destination would be gone, as if they had never existed. Nothing. Then Tyler's voice from outside, sharp and strange. "Wait. Be quiet. Listen." Dylan unzipped the tent door and stepped out into the cold morning air. Tyler was standing motionless beside the collapsed mess tent, his head tilted, his freckled face tight with concentration. They stood together in silence for 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then it came again, a sound so weak and so distorted by distance that it barely qualified as sound at all. But it was human. It was unmistakably, impossibly human. Dylan ran. He did not think about it, did not calculate direction or distance, did not stop to grab medical supplies or a radio. He simply ran, his boots hammering the loose rock of the moraine, his eyes scanning the gray-brown terrain ahead for the source of the sound. Tyler ran behind him, shorter legs pumping, camera bouncing against his chest where it hung from its strap. Dylan crested a low ridge of boulders about 150 meters from camp and stopped so abruptly that Tyler nearly collided with him from behind. Marcus was lying face down on the rocks, 200 meters ahead. For a moment, Dylan's mind refused to process what he was seeing, rejected it the way the eye rejects an optical illusion, because the figure on the ground bore almost no resemblance to the man he had last seen hanging at the end of a rope in a blizzard 3 days ago. Marcus was skeletal. His face, turned to one side against the rock, was swollen and blistered from sunburn, the skin peeling away in raw patches that exposed pink flesh beneath. His eye sockets were sunken so deep that the eyes themselves seemed to have retreated into his skull. His right leg was grotesque, swollen to 3 times its normal size from hip to ankle. The fabric of his climbing pants stretched so tight that it had split along the seams, revealing skin that was purple and black with bruising. His hands were spread out in front of him, palms down on the rock, the fingers cracked and crusted with dried blood from 3 days of dragging himself across ice and stone. His clothes were shredded. His harness hung in tatters from his waist. He looked like something the mountain had chewed up and spat out, a broken thing that should not have been alive but was, because his eyes were open. And when he heard the footsteps on the rock, his head turned, slowly, with enormous effort, and he saw Dylan. And he smiled. It was a terrible smile, crooked and split-lipped and full of pain, but it was real, and it was alive, and it was the most devastating thing Dylan had ever seen. Dylan covered the distance in seconds. He dropped to his knees beside Marcus and gathered him up, pulling his upper body off the rock and into his arms, feeling how light he was, how insubstantial, as if the mountain had burned away everything that was not essential and left only bone and will. Dylan was shaking. His whole body was shaking and his face was wet, and he was saying the only words his mouth could form, repeating them like a prayer or a confession. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Marcus's head rested against Dylan's shoulder. His breathing was shallow and uneven, each exhale carrying a faint rattling sound that spoke of damaged ribs and dehydrated lungs. When he spoke, his voice was barely there. A whisper like sandpaper dragged across stone, so quiet that Dylan had to press his ear close to hear it. "You did the right thing. If you hadn't cut the rope, we'd both be dead. Dylan closed his eyes and held his friend tighter and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Tyler arrived and knelt beside them, his face pale beneath his freckles. He touched Marcus's shoulder gently, as if confirming that he was solid, that this was not a hallucination born of grief and altitude. Then he stood and sprinted back to camp for water, the first aid kit, and the satellite phone. He returned in minutes, breathing hard, and crouched beside Marcus with a water bottle. He tilted it carefully against Marcus's cracked lips, letting the water trickle in small amounts. Too much too fast could send a severely dehydrated body into shock. Marcus swallowed, coughed, swallowed again. His eyes closed with something that looked like ecstasy, the simple pleasure of water on a tongue that had known nothing but snow for 3 days. They carried him to the tent between them, Dylan supporting his torso and Tyler lifting his legs with agonizing care to avoid jarring the shattered knee. Inside, they laid him on a sleeping bag and covered him with every piece of insulation they had. Tyler fashioned a crude splint from a tent pole and strips of fabric, immobilizing the broken leg as best he could, while Marcus gritted his teeth and gripped Dylan's hand so hard that the knuckles went white. Dylan gave him small sips of water mixed with electrolyte powder, waited, then gave him more. He fed him fragments of an energy bar, broken into pieces small enough to dissolve on his tongue. Marcus ate with the desperate focus of a man who had forgotten what food was and was remembering it one crumb at a time. Tyler called the Rescue Coordination Center and reported that Marcus Reed was alive. The dispatcher, the same calm professional voice Lauren had spoken to 3 days earlier, was silent for a full 3 seconds before responding. Then Tyler called Hank Morrison on the frequency Robert had given them. Hank was already airborne, 40 minutes south, following the Glacier corridor with Corinne Voss beside him, scanning the terrain through binoculars. When he heard Tyler's transmission, alive, conscious, critical condition, requesting immediate extraction, Hank banked the helicopter north and pushed the throttle forward. Corinne began preparing her medical kit, pulling out IV bags and cervical collars and thermal blankets, with the practiced speed of someone who had done this many times, but never stopped caring about doing it fast. The helicopter appeared over the southern ridge exactly 57 minutes after Tyler's call. The sound of the rotors reached camp before the aircraft did, a deep rhythmic thudding that grew from a whisper to a roar as Hank brought the machine down onto a flat section of moraine, 100 meters from the tents. Corinne was out before the skids fully settled, running toward the tent in a low crouch beneath the spinning blades, her medical bag in one hand and a folding stretcher under the other arm. She assessed Marcus in under 2 minutes. Pulse thready but present, blood pressure dangerously low, severe dehydration, hypothermia, compound fracture of the right knee with significant tissue swelling, probable fractures to 2 or 3 left ribs, multiple lacerations and abrasions to hands, arms, and left knee. Early signs of infection in the open wounds. She started an IV line in his left arm, hung a bag of saline from a carabiner clipped to the tent's ceiling, and wrapped him in a thermal blanket that crinkled like aluminum foil. She told him he was going to be fine, and the way she said it, direct, factual, without false warmth, made Marcus believe her. They loaded him onto the stretcher and carried him to the helicopter. Dylan walked beside him the entire way, one hand resting on Marcus's shoulder, not speaking, not needing to. Tyler followed with the packs. Hank kept the rotors turning, watching the sky to the west where a thin line of cloud suggested they had a window of maybe 3 hours before the next weather system moved in. Corinne secured the stretcher in the cabin, checked the IV flow, and gave Marcus a measured dose of morphine that softened the hard edges of his pain for the first time in 3 days. Marcus looked up at the ceiling of the helicopter and felt the vibration of the engine through the stretcher frame and understood that he was leaving the mountain. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers clumsy and slow, and pulled out the photograph. It was ruined, soaked, creased, the colors bled into a blur that made Lauren's face almost unrecognizable. But he held it against his chest as the helicopter lifted off, and the glacier fell away below them, and the mountain that had tried to kill him shrank to a white point on the horizon. The flight to Anchorage took just over 2 hours. Hank radioed ahead, and the hospital was waiting. Lauren was standing on the rooftop helipad when they landed, her hair whipping in the downdraft, her hands pressed flat against her belly. Robert stood behind her, tall and rigid, his silver hair bright against the gray sky, his jaw set in the expression of a man who has prepared himself for the worst and does not yet dare to hope for anything better. The rotors slowed, and Corinne slid the cabin door open, and the stretcher emerged. Lauren saw him. He was gaunt and broken and wrapped in foil, and his face was so damaged by sun and wind that she might not have recognized him on the street. But his eyes found her immediately, as if every remaining unit of energy in his body had been reserved for this single act of focus, and his hand came up, the hand that had dragged him 9 kilometers across a glacier, the hand that was cut and calloused and crusted with blood that was not yet fully dry. And he spoke. His voice was destroyed, a cracked whisper that the rotor wash should have obliterated. But Lauren heard it the way mothers hear their children through walls and across distances that should make hearing impossible. I kept my promise. Lauren stepped forward and took his hand. The tears came then, the ones she had held back for 3 days through phone calls and briefings and the long, silent hours at the kitchen table. They ran down her face, and she did not wipe them away. She lifted his hand and placed it on her belly, on the curve where their child was waiting, and the baby kicked against his palm, a firm, definitive kick, the kind that makes the whole surface of the skin move, as if the child inside had felt the pressure of its father's hand and responded with the only language it had. Marcus closed his eyes. His cracked lips moved into something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough, and his fingers spread across Lauren's belly, and for a long moment the helipad was silent, except for the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of Lauren breathing, and the wind moving across the roof of the hospital, where a man who should have been dead was holding the 2 people he had crawled through hell to reach. Marcus spent 6 months in recovery. The knee required 4 separate surgeries, the first to remove bone fragments and repair what remained of the joint, the second to address an infection that set in during the first week, the third to insert a partial prosthetic, and the fourth, months later, to correct an alignment issue that left him unable to bend past 45 degrees. The ribs healed on their own, though for weeks he could not laugh or cough or sneeze without a pain that reminded him of the crevasse. His hands healed slowly, the deep cuts on his palms leaving scars that he would carry for the rest of his life. Thick, pale lines that he sometimes traced with his thumb when he was thinking about something he could not put into words. He walked with a limp that would never fully disappear. He would never climb a high mountain again. He told a journalist who asked him about it that he felt no regret, that the mountains had given him everything that mattered, and that he had no right to ask for more. 2 months after the rescue, Lauren gave birth to a healthy boy at Providence, Alaska Medical Center. Marcus was in the room, sitting in a wheelchair beside the bed, holding Lauren's hand with the same grip that had held the rope and the rock and the ice. When the nurse placed the baby in his arms, Marcus looked down at the small red face and the clenched fists and the dark eyes that stared up at him with the unfocused intensity of someone seeing the world for the first time, and he wept openly, without shame, the tears falling onto the blue hospital blanket. They named him James Dillon Reed, James for Lauren's father, Dillon for the man who had not left him on the mountain. The climbing community's reaction was divided. Some praised Dillon for his attempt to lower Marcus down the face, calling it an act of extraordinary courage and loyalty. Others condemned him for cutting the rope, arguing that he should have held on longer, tried harder, found another way. The criticism was loudest online, where people who had never stood on a mountain in a blizzard felt qualified to judge decisions made at 5,000 meters in the dark. Dillon bore it quietly. He did not defend himself in public. He did not give interviews. He retreated into his work, guiding clients on safer mountains, and carried the weight of the judgment the way he had carried everything else, silently and without complaint. But Marcus would not allow the silence to stand. In every interview he gave, in every conversation where the subject arose, he said the same thing. That decision saved both our lives. If Dylan had not cut the rope, we would both be dead at the bottom of that cliff. He made the only choice that gave either of us a chance. I owe him everything. Dylan and Marcus remained close. The rope that had been cut between them had, in some strange way, bound them tighter than any line of nylon ever could. They did not talk about the mountain often. They did not need to. The understanding between them existed below the level of language, in the space where shared experience becomes a kind of silent conversation that never ends. Every year, on the anniversary of the day, Marcus was found alive on the moraine 200 meters from base camp. The families gathered. Marcus and Lauren. Little James, growing taller each year, with his mother's steady eyes and his father's quiet intensity. Dylan, who eventually married a park ranger named Sophie and settled in a cabin outside Talkeetna. Tyler, still taking photographs, still laughing at his own jokes. Robert, who sat at the head of the table and said little, but smiled more than he used to. They cooked together, ate together, told stories that made them laugh and others that made them go quiet. They did not gather to remember the pain. They gathered to celebrate the fact that they were still here, still breathing, still capable of sitting around a table with the people they loved. And when the evening grew late and the dishes were cleared and the children were put to bed, Marcus would sometimes step outside alone and look up at the sky, at the stars scattered across the darkness like ice crystals on a black wall, and he would think about the mountain and the crevasse, and the 3 days of crawling and the sound of the rope being cut in the storm. And he would go back inside and close the door and sit down beside his wife and his son, and the warmth of the room would settle around him like a blanket, and he would know that he was home.
You know, you do not have to climb a mountain to understand what Marcus went through. Life gives all of us our own version of that glacier. Maybe it is a job you lost and you do not know how you will pay rent next month. Maybe it is a marriage that is falling apart and you are trying to hold it together with everything you have. Maybe it is a diagnosis that changed your whole world in one sentence. Whatever it is, there will be a moment when the distance between where you are and where you need to be feels impossible.
And when that moment comes, do what Marcus did. Do not look at the whole 9 kilometers. Just look at the next rock. Just get through the next 20 minutes. Then the next. Then the next. That is how people survive. Not with grand plans or superhuman strength, but with small, stubborn steps that nobody sees and nobody applauds, until one day you look up and realize you made it. And do not forget the people around you. Dylan made a decision that haunted him, but he never abandoned his friend when it mattered most. Lauren refused to sit and wait when the person she loved was in danger. Tyler stayed at camp, even though no one would have blamed him for leaving. We all need those people, and we all need to be that person for someone else.
I want to thank every single one of you for staying with this story until the end. If it touched your heart, please share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing you stories like this one. And drop a comment below. Let me know what part of this story stayed with you the most. I pray that God blesses each and every one of you watching right now. May He give you strength when the road feels too long and courage when the night feels too dark. If you believe that, type Amen in the comments. I will see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.